Good evening, folks. This is The Weird Part, and I am your host, Vincent Treewell. Tonight, I am pleased to welcome a very special guest, Joshua Cutchins. This should be a really excellent episode of this particular podcast. Josh, do you want to say hello to our listeners?
Hello to our listeners.
All right. Obviously, Joshua Cutchins probably needs little to no introduction to people who would listen to The Weird Part. He's the author of several books, a true paranormal researcher and investigator, and probably as well as a professional musician, I should add that, and probably the leading intellectual pioneer when it comes to the topic of the Fae Folk fairy phenomenon. But it deals with a lot of other things too. Let's just kind of jump right into it.
Well, I'm flattered. I'm going to push back on that about the leading scholar on the Fae Folk, because there are people who can talk circles around me when it comes to the nitty-gritty of things. I will say that I'm not aware of anybody who has focused on sort of situating most of the supernatural in that sort of fairy folk lens. So maybe you can get away with saying that.
And I guess I'm speaking from my own, perspective, my own knowledge. Until I heard you on Soraya's podcast and on Timothy Renner's podcast, I didn't know anybody was taking that particular topic seriously and looking into it. I read 14 Times, a British magazine, and they'll mention Fae topics once in a while, but not in a very in-depth manner at all. And so I only was aware that it was a thing because of your work.
It is the gift that keeps on giving. Especially when you look at the the alien abduction phenomena, which you can sort of separate, if you want to, from UFOs a little bit. I think that those are sometimes over conflated. Not that they shouldn't be related, but sometimes I think they're over conflated. But yeah, there was a time when I used to say that well, maybe the Fae phenomena and the alien abduction phenomena are maybe they're sort of using the same mechanisms, or maybe they're and I've just come around to the point where I think that it really is one and the same thing. Now the jury's out as to exactly what that means. I think that the fairy interpretation is probably incorrect, and that the alien interpretation is probably more incorrect, and that the fairy interpretation is probably closer to whatever the objective truth is. But I still think that it's kind of a slippery thing to try to pin down. But I'm at the point now where I can, if you give me enough time, I can find some sort of correlation between the alien abduction stuff and the fairy folklore as well. It just after I saw that there was an analog for alien implants in fairy folklore, I was like, okay, I'm done. This is this is way too close for comfort. I'm pretty sure that I can find something that, if you look at it through our modern cultural lens, is a pretty close match for what people talk, especially in Western Europe, but honestly all throughout the world, because it's something that every culture has, are these legends of little people.
Yes, and that it's all around the world, and we don't have any solid answers what it is, but at least we can say some things that these repeat over time and around the world in ways that there's something there, even if we don't know what the hell it is.
Yeah, and I think that people get really caught up and hung up on was this story true? Is that story true? Was this a hoax? Did this person say this or that or the other? And I really think that, for me at least, none of that really matters so much as the fact that you see these same things repeating themselves out over time and space. You have you have people, the example I always use is like you have a farmer in Casey, Iowa, who's talking about the same stuff that somebody did in an ancient Mesopotamian text. The idea, the odds that he's read that or something, just they don't. I don't think they hold up well. So, for me, it's that comparativism that really is the bread and butter of Fortean study, I think.
Yes, I think you make a very valid point there. That yes, when you see it over and over, there has to be some commonality. Just to kind of shift gears a little bit, kind of tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get involved in being interested in all this stuff?
I'm kind of amazed when I talk to people who aren't into this stuff, right? It's always been so interesting to me, and it was never really it was never really looked down upon in my household. My parents were of the mindset that as long as I was reading, it didn't really matter what I was reading, right? So I would check out books on a lot of these different things. I was never really so much into the alien thing, or even really myths and legends or anything. I was always into cryptids. That was my jam growing up, and looking back on it, I've talked to my dad since then. He's like, "Oh yeah, I was subscribed to the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization newsletter at one point," and so I guess my dad had a bit of an interest in that as well. But I was always interested in monster movies and creature features. Like that was always my favorite sort of thing. If it had a good creature or a good creature design, I was there for it. And I think that just sort of naturally grew out of that. As far as how I got involved, because it's a big difference, right? Like if you're actually going to sully your name with this with this stuff, big difference. Is I was at a miserable desk job working at the University of Georgia, and I was commuting an hour each day, and I was looking for podcasts, and I happened upon Mysterious Universe, which which sort of leads you in other directions to other people's podcasts and stuff. And I started listening to that and some other shows, and it really just that commute was basically what rekindled my interest. I would go on a business trip to Tampa or something, and I would have to spend 10 hours in a university van. So I'd load up my podcasts on my iPod, and I'd just listen to paranormal podcasts all the way down. And it was, I suppose, probably 2014, or maybe late 2013. I got a gift card for Christmas from my sister-in-law, and I put it towards a Bigfoot book because I said, I'm going to indulge myself. I haven't bought a Bigfoot book in a long time, very much of the flesh and blood camp at the time. But I was like, I'm going to indulge myself with the Bigfoot book. And I picked out J. Robert Alley's Raincoast Sasquatch, which is a great little book that I don't think people talk about enough.
I don't think I've heard of that one. Yeah.
It's about coastal Alaskan Bigfoot sightings. And there's a lot of indigenous lore and stuff in there. And I remember reading that I think I tell this story so many times. I should really refresh my memory on which is which. But I think it's the Tlingit Bigfoot analog, the Bequas. And if I got that wrong, I'm sorry. But I believe it's their Bigfoot analog, where they held a belief that if you encountered a Bequas in the forest and it gave you something to eat, you shouldn't eat it or you'd be trapped with the Bequas forever. Now, I don't know where I picked it up, the fairy food taboo, that if you ate food in fairyland, you'd be trapped there forever. But for some reason I had it in the back of my head. It was like, if I ever run into a situation where I'm up against the little people, like, that's the one thing to remember, right? And so I read that.
Eat or drink anything they give you. Yes.
Never. And I said, that's an interesting correlation. Somebody should write a book on that. And I said, and I sat with that thought for a couple of weeks, and I was like, could it be me? So, for all my complaints about that job at Georgia, the summers for staff were a lot less less hectic. So I actually ended up writing a good chunk of that book at work
Nice.
that summer.
That's a good
And
job sometimes.
yeah, well, yeah. I mean, yeah, I guess so. But then when it's time to release it, like everybody's like, what are you doing? um, and I so in 2015, a Trojan Feast came out, and that same month I quit my job at UGA, not because I thought that I would you know make a living doing this, which has only sort of started to resemble that. But I was just sort of miserable at that job, and I said I'm going to try to get a different job, and I'm just going to leave this situation. So I applied to a bunch of jobs, and I'm pretty sure I made it through some of the hiring process until a certain point, and I feel like at some point in each of those job application processes, somebody was like, let's Google this guy. Can we Google this guy?
You
And then
really
of course,
think that it hurts you professionally?
oh, I absolutely do. There was one interview where somebody asked what my other interests were, and I made an allusion to having written a book, and it came out, and you could sort of see him pull back a little bit. So that's fine. I had already sort of pivoted to doing more teaching, music and gigging a lot more. And so I just ended up doing that for several years until my sons were born. And then, like I said, in the last couple of years, it's been something where I've started looking for some more opportunities, and that's what I'm doing full time right now. Is actually I let go of teaching because, well, for a bunch of different reasons, but I let go of teaching, so I just play and I just write right now. And I'm not the breadwinner, but I keep the wolf from I don't keep the wolf from the door. I keep the wolf a little bit farther from the door. Let's put it that way.
No, I understand. Yes.
Yeah.
That was a concern. I mean, it's no big secret. You won't find Vincent Trewell on my birth certificate. Because I am an attorney licensed in the state of Wisconsin, and I had some jobs where I didn't want necessarily my other interests to come up,
Mm-hmm.
and also my legal name is very common, and Google searches don't help. I just disappear into the void.
Right.
But Vincent Trewell, there's only one, because it's not really, Trewell isn't really a last name. It's the term for if you have fir trees and it snows a lot,
Mm-hmm.
the little cave that builds under the fir tree,
Yeah.
that's a Trewell.
Oh, well, there you go.
I saw this on a nature show and said, perfect. And so that helps with the Google searches, and it puts a little distance sometimes where I might want a little distance. But yeah, we digressed all over the place. But yeah,
No. I mean, I think it bears repeating though, and it speaks to the fact that this is one of the few. I mean, I know we could probably digress even further with this, but there's still a stigma attached to this stuff. And even I find myself backpedaling when I talk to people, because that's the thing. Whenever I'm at the gig, everybody's like, what's up with the UFO for the thing? And, whenever I'm at the UFO conference, they're like, what, you play the tuba? What? Everybody's always a little bit baffled. But when I'm at the gig and that comes up, I'm like, well, look, I don't really want to get into it right now, but what you think I think is not what I think, right?
Oh yes, and there definitely is stigma. Despite the New York Times saying UFOs are real, I felt that was going to be so much more monumental than it turned out to be, which was almost nothing. At the time though, when they said it, I'm like, okay, we're about 6 months away from the press conference with the alien, and they're going to turn over the bodies and the ships, and it's all out there, and I will have been right, and you guys we'll see that. But that's not what happened, obviously. But yeah, there's still stigma around. It's bad.
And I don't want to be too disparaging of the community, because we were just talking earlier about how much we love
Oh yeah,
these communities, but at the same time, a lot of the dialogue that's out there is just like the most basic entry level stuff. And I realize that everybody's going to start somewhere, but these topics in general are so complex and interesting if you take them beyond that. If you're not just dredging up dogman stories for YouTube or something, right? Like if you actually start talking about like the nature of consciousness and the nature of reality and the intersection between the imaginal and the imaginary and all these different things, like that's really interesting stuff to me. But with that, you have to come into that with a certain level of agnosticism that I don't think a lot of people are comfortable with nowadays.
That is.
I want to come into this topic and I want to find out that there are little green aliens coming down here in spaceships. And it's like, okay, well, this could be really rewarding if you didn't approach it with that idea out of the gate.
The people who are disappointed that Hellier didn't end up with a goblin in a cage.
Exactly.
We got him. Here he is. Come on.
Exactly.
That was never going to end up that way. And either you can accept that or, maybe you should do something else.
Yeah, 100%. That's the most concise way to put it. Yeah.
Not to shift too hard, but just to ask, you are a trained professional musician. Have you ever encountered anything involving music and the paranormal? Like, I mean, this is a big part of the Fae lore. What can you tell us about that?
Well, personally, I haven't.
You're a well-known non-experiencer. Is that about right?
Well, I mean, I've had some. I've had a lot of maybe things happen, right? You know what I mean? I've had a lot of maybe things and like maybe 2 or 3 unambiguous things where I couldn't, after you hear about it or you see it, after you experience that experience, you can't get the toothpaste back in the tube. But for the most part, you talk to people like our mutual friend Soraya, and it's like, oh, it's a Tuesday. Of course you saw, a mysterious bubble form out of nowhere and float across your living room. Like, yeah, of course that happened to you. So like, compared to most people that I know, I would say that I'm relatively psychically dead as a doornail. But I do have things happen from time to time. It's always
and same here. I really extremely rarely in my life has anything occurred that I can point to and say, no, this is something not of the ordinary average day-to-day life. A handful of times,
Yeah. And so I would love to have had a Bigfoot step out of the trees and wave hi at me, but the best it's like God looked down and said, okay, well, best I can do is Civil War ghost. How about that? So that's okay, I'll take Civil War ghost. And you won't know it at the time. You won't know it until later. I'm like, okay. Yeah, so the music thing, I haven't personally experienced. There's something to it though. And I think that it would be a good topic for a book at some point, but some people have kind of mined that territory a little bit. So it's not quite the sort of, when I tend to write stuff, I like to sort of go into relatively virgin territory, so that I, have a broad canvas to paint on. He said mixing metaphors.
No, I get you. I started writing a nonfiction book myself and then realized somebody had written that book already, basically. So,
yeah,
okay,
that's the worst feeling, is when you get halfway through a book and you're like, oh, this person wrote this article on this. Oh crap, did they did they say everything that I'm going to say? But yeah, there's something to it, regarding the fairy folklore. It's something that you see time and time and again. Oftentimes is like, one of the primary signifiers that the good people are around you. There are even some, I mean, if I were to write about music in the paranormal, I'd probably be approaching it from this angle, because I do have the classical training, and I also have a musicology degree, so I might be able to talk about some of the music part of it more, with a little bit more authority than some people, I guess. But there are some melodies that supposedly are attributed to the Fae Folk, that we still have today. There are some contention back and forth whether or not Danny Boy was one of those melodies, if memory serves. So to roll up your sleeves and dig into that from a musicological standpoint and be like, well, this is what's happening harmonically, and this is why this works and why it doesn't, to sort of look at it from that angle would be, I think might be pretty rewarding. But music in general is something that also happens across these other contact modalities that just doesn't get discussed quite as often. By which I mean, just experiences with intelligences. It's quite common in near-death experiences, almost always described the same way as, the fairy music was. Oh, it was wonderful music that didn't seem to be using an earthly scale, and it was indescribable in its beauty. Like, same thing you hear from the people who hear fairy music, and you hear similar things from people who hear music aboard UFOs, which is not as common, but is relatively common. But again, if you look into the contactee literature, I think it was Adamski, used that same description to describe some Saturnian music that he heard when he went to Saturn, supposedly. And if you're positioned in that area of like, well, I don't know if this is true or not. Like, if you ask me if I really think Adamski went to Saturn, I'm going to say no. But it's interesting that he would describe it that way. It's interesting that he's not like, yeah, it was, it sounded like the Bee Gees. He described it in this other way, which I think is really interesting. So I think there's some things to pull out of there, to pull out of that. But yeah, it's on the table. There are a couple of projects that I plan on getting to at some point. And maybe if I take it easy on myself and, don't try to write a 260,000 word book, then maybe I might have something enough to say about it that's unique and novel and new.
Yes. I don't think I've told you about this. I have mentioned it, but I had a very strange experience a few months ago where I was going to the grocery store, and it was the dead of winter, so it's 11 degrees, okay? And sitting on a park bench, there's one bench, and I've never seen anybody sit there before or since. Sitting on this bench is this well-dressed man who's not dressed for the elements, okay? It's 11 degrees. Yeah.
Because when I was in Wisconsin and I would have to dress up for concerts, I had my overcoat on, the big heavy overcoat. Parka,
yeah.
Well, no, not even. Yeah, I had, I still look nice. I had the actual overcoat.
Yes, the lawyer's coat. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There's one. I know it's wool, and it's 3/4 length. And yeah.
Some of the time, the other time I was in my big green LL Bean winter gear. Yeah.
Yes, but it gets cold as hell.
Yeah.
And it's 11 degrees. I'm going to the grocery store, and there's this guy who's not dressed for the elements, wearing a suit and tie, playing a violin. And I wanted to get his picture just for Instagram, but I figured it's kind of impolite to take a musician's picture without giving them some small amount of money.
Yeah.
This is not a spot where like local musicians come to. It's not at all, not in the least. This is a strip mall, grocery store, and this guy is sitting there playing the violin. He, as I recall, he's a black man and he's wearing a suit and tie, and he's playing the violin. And I said, I'm going to go in the grocery store. I'm going to get $5 back. I'm going to give it to him and ask to take his picture. And then I get close, and he's playing Celtic music. He's playing, and I am not a musicologist in the faintest. I don't know enough. I know this. I've been to enough festivals that it's Scotch or it's Irish, and it's violin, and there's an electronic component too. And that music was unlike anything I've ever heard. Not just because he was really good, but it had, and it's subjective. I understand. I can't prove any of this, but I felt like drawn to that guy. Like I wanted to go over there, hang out with him. And so I went in the grocery store. I come back and he's gone. Didn't see him come, didn't see him leave. Poof. Never saw him again. And I have always thought that might have been one of the good folk.
Well, you know what I think is interesting about that too is that the dry winter air and the lower temperature are not great for your string instrument. Brass players, you just got a big hunk of metal, so, and you're putting warm air through it, so we sort of soldier on. But for violin, and that's the thing about that people in the upper Midwest might not realize, but there's snow on the ground, but it can get pretty dry up there, the air.
Oh yes.
So the idea that you would subject yourself to that in Milwaukee in in the middle of winter, or not in the middle of winter, but you said a couple of weeks ago, so kind of the tail end of winter.
Oh no, this is a couple months ago. It was like the dead of winter.
Well, and the finger dexterity that you need for, I guess all stringed instruments, but especially those bowed instrument families. Why would you choose that? Because you've got to have your fingers out in the cold too, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. I will say that.
That's it. It just seems so out of context that he's not bundled up. And why on earth would you do this on a park bench in front of a grocery store? Obviously it could have happened just normally, naturally, but I just took a huge paranormal vibe from that.
Yes, that's very much in the same spirit of the stuff that I get. Like on my honeymoon, long story short, I was being a drunken idiot and shouting out from the hot tub, Bigfoot cries, and then we get in the
Just
car.
Let me a moment to bask in that image.
Yeah. And we get in the car to go the next morning, and there's a basketball-sized rock wedged behind one of my rear tires.
Damn.
And I can't say that was anything paranormal. There are a lot of reasons. If I sort of set the scene for you, there's a lot of reasons that I think would make it seem less likely to be a prank, but I can't say it wasn't a prank, so I really don't know. But yeah, that's very much in the same spirit that I get.
Yes.
Of the things that I get.
So many of these things, you can never prove it. It's not, there's no DNA, but it's something.
Well, and that's the lovely thing, and too, I think about a lot of the stuff is that it does have that sort of re-enchanting quality in terms of your worldview, because I think a lot of people have stuff like that happen, and I suspect that a lot of people are interfacing with, call it what you will, the paranormal, the supernatural, whatever. I think that people interface with that a lot more often than they realize. It's just so subtle that they don't think about it. So you think you saw a shadow and you turn around and you're like, what was that? And nothing happens, and you're like, okay, I guess it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. Yeah, that happens, but who says it wasn't actually something that you just ended up writing off?
Oh yes.
And
I think that happens a lot.
Yeah, and so I think that when you're involved in these topics, it gives you a little bit more time to pause and process. And you probably, if you want to stay sane, you probably still throw it into that, coincidence basket, and you still throw it into that, maybe sort of basket. But it does sort of make you stop and appreciate some of the peculiarities that we come up against every day a little bit more.
Yes, indeed. And just to kind of shift gears a little bit, you have written the book literally on paranormal smells, odors. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so it's called The Brimstone Deceit, which I think is an accurate title to some degree, but it also kind of sounds like a Joel Osteen book, And I think some people are put off by that because they think that, I'm just going to be talking about how demons smell of sulfur all the time. But while that's definitely the glue that holds the book together, I talk about all sorts of paranormal smells in it. But having said that, that smell of sulfur or brimstone is definitely, if not a majority of smells, definitely a plurality of smells. And once you start looking at that, you sort of tumble down this rabbit hole of the science of smell, which is its own thing, and then the philosophy of smell, which is something that I had no idea existed. But then you also start, what I found, one of the things that I found most interesting is that, so people report sulfurous smells in abductions and around UFOs and of course demons, because that's what everybody goes to when they hear that. But, it's a very common Bigfoot odor. And what I discovered, which I don't think people really realize, is that the reason that Satan and demons supposedly smell of sulfur in the Bible is not because they're naturally stinky. I mean, if you look at the passages, in the Bible, sulfur is very clearly a cleansing mechanism that God employs. It talks about his breath coming out like sulfur, and sulfur, to this day is antifungal, antimicrobial qualities. A lot of acne medications have sulfites in them. So the reason that the devil smells that way and his legions smell that way is because God is trying to cleanse them by throwing them into the lake of burning fire. So it's not inherently...
Let me just pause and say, wow, that's an insight I have never heard once. Go ahead.
Yeah. A lot of people, don't really put that together, and I was amazed to find it out too. And then you sort of start looking at sulfur as, the way that people would talk about sulfur and how it's become conflated with ozone over time. Because, for example, your natural gas stove doesn't actually smell. They add sulfur compounds called thiols to it, which are also found in skunk as well. And thiols get their name from thion, from theos, from theos, which is because the Greeks thought that when lightning struck the ground, that was the smell of sulfur. Well, it's not. It's the smell of ozone. But you find this conflation all the way through, even the 19th century, where they go in the other direction. They say, oh, you need to go to the seaside because the fresh ozone will help your condition, if you're consumptive or something. But what they were talking about in that case was some of the sulfur compounds is what they were citing. So it all gets flipped around. And then you also have UFOs that smell like ozone. That's a very common smell that people talk about as well. So it really is this very complex thing where you're trying to parse out what people mean versus what they say. There's, in smell philosophy, there's even a term for this. They call it the tip of the nose phenomena, where you recognize the smell, and smell is miraculous because it's encoded to memory in a way that few other senses are. You get the memories whether you want to or not when you smell a very specific odor. But a lot of times the smells are dependent upon context clues and all this stuff. And then you look at sulfur as a compound itself specifically in the way that it combines. And a lot of people say, well, it smelled like sulfur, it smelled like brimstone. Well, sulfur doesn't smell. It only smells when it combusts, and I think pure sulfur, if memory serves, can combust in direct sunlight. So it's pretty sensitive compound. But as soon as it does that, it's a sensitive element. As soon as it combusts or it combines with other things, then it's a different compound. So you have sort of different compounds that you have to talk about, like sulfur dioxide, which is that fireworks smell or that burning match smell, another common UFO smell, or the one that we always think about a lot, which is hydrogen sulfide. Farts don't smell because of methane. Methane, again, is odorless. What you're smelling is mostly these hydrogen sulfide particles, which are a very small component in farts. But the thing
here's your first, folks. That's what we've come to talk about this evening.
Farts, yeah. But no, this is interesting because you don't need that much. I think that we can detect hydrogen sulfide at a concentration of 0.5 parts per billion, which means that if you had an ink dropper and dropped it into the back of a tanker truck filled with water, that ink would be at twice the concentration that we can detect hydrogen sulfide in the environment. We are extremely, extremely finely attuned to recognize hydrogen sulfide because in significant amounts it is a poison, and it often signifies decay in the absence of oxygen. So it is sort of a defense mechanism. But then you say, okay, well, it's a defense mechanism and we're super fine tuned to smell it. If these phenomena have control over that, what are they trying to tell us? Are they trying to get our attention? So, you look. Well, go ahead.
This reminds me of two things. Some people have speculated that the beings that appear in a lot of paranormal phenomena are decaying,
Mm-hmm.
and that what we're smelling is the stench of decay.
I love that idea. I didn't pursue it as much as I should have in the book, but I've since come around to really love that idea. Um, the direction that I ended up taking it in, and I think that one's as valid or more valid than this, but the direction that I ended up taking it in was that, fascinatingly enough, when I looked at sort of all the smells that people reported, it was like more or less half, I would say, if I had to really put a percentage on it. More or less 50% of all paranormal smells tend to be hydrogen sulfide. And the remainder you can divide into a bunch of different smells. Smells of ammonia, smells of sulfur dioxide, which is that gunpowder smell. Smells of ozone, et cetera, et cetera. And I said to myself, so what does this mean that half are this and half are that? Obviously we have half. What is this other half that's this sort of mixed bag of smells? And I discovered that a lot of the most common smells on that other half, the non-hydrogen sulfide half of smells that are recorded, are what are known as trigeminal stimulants. And it's something that we all know about, but we don't necessarily have a name for. But the trigeminal nerve is actually the largest nerve in your face. And if you've ever smelled ammonia or smelling salts, it's that smell. It actually shocks you. It yes. Ignites that nerve in your face. And so a lot of these smells... So basically what I ended up saying then was like, well, so you've got hydrogen sulfide on one side and these trigeminal stimulants that sort of rouse you or they alert you on the other side. Well, as it turns out, there's some recent research that I found from a TED Talk that talked about how hydrogen sulfide in very specific, minutely monitored amounts could actually induce suspended animation in lab mice. And of course, the person that was talking about this was very excited about the possible applications for space travel or something. But I said to myself, okay, so you have hydrogen sulfide can put you under, and trigeminal stimulants, the other half of the smells, wake you up. So I wonder.
Wow, okay, yeah.
So you see where I'm going with this. So I sort of wondered if perhaps that when people remember the hydrogen sulfide smell, they're not remembering the smell from the beginning of the encounter, right? And then whatever this force is, the supernatural force, is using hydrogen sulfide somehow. I can't posit a mechanism, but it's somehow using hydrogen sulfide to slip people into an altered state of consciousness. And then if they remembered the other smells instead, those trigeminal stimulants, they're remembering the smell that brought them out of that altered state of consciousness. Because I do think that altered states of consciousness play some sort of important role in a lot of these phenomena.
Absolutely. I happen to know that ammonia brings you into the moment. In weightlifting competitions, some guys hit ammonia right before they go lift because it puts you in the here and now. It focuses you immediately. You're in the moment. It wakes you up. And
yeah, I'd imagine it's that trigeminal stimulant component is what they're chasing after. Is I would imagine.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's exactly it. Wow. The other thing was, I'm thinking of the skunk ape and the stench associated with the abominable snowman, and it seemed really weird that a primate animal would stink so bad.
Right. And you hear these stories about it's almost as if the smell switches on or off in some encounters as well. And people I have experienced some frustration with this book because people are often like, I'll bet Bigfoot have scent glands. So I don't know, maybe somebody should look into that. I'm like, guys, I did the work here. It's right here for you. There is some indication that I believe gorillas are able to release a sort of rubbery, an odor like burnt rubber when they're alarmed. But to my knowledge, it is not a voluntary control that they exert. At the same time, it's interesting when you sort of look at a lot of these foul odors that people describe. Like you said, the skunk ape. Well, again, one of the primary components in The smell of skunk that we find repulsive is a sulfur compound. We're talking about the burning rubber smell that some gorillas might release when they're agitated. Well, burning rubber is often vulcanized. And how do you vulcanize it? You vulcanize it with sulfur compounds. So a lot of these things seem to keep on tracing back to that odor of brimstone, that odor of sulfur, time and time again.
That is a really interesting and little, other than by yourself, investigated subfield of the whole paranormal world, and especially of the Bigfoot world. You know,
in a lot of ways, I think it's the book that I'm proudest of, because I was not a chemistry whiz, so I had to go back and learn a lot of chemistry. But like, you know, you think about like people being like, we need to solve the paranormal with science. I'm like, okay, well, this is my sciencey book, you know. And that's one of my favorite things to do is to take something that people have remarked upon in passing, or they've maybe dedicated a paragraph to here and there throughout the paranormal literature. And if you see that same paragraph showing up over and over and over again, like the brimstone thing, then you're like, okay, well, I think that there's something to this, and this deserves to be expanded out into a longer form discussion of this aspect of the phenomena that not as many people are paying attention to.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Speaking of books that you've written, you and Timothy Renner really took Bigfoot research to another level with the 2-volume Where the Footprints End books. What would you say is the weirdest piece of high strangeness you came across researching that? What really surprised you?
I mean, I will give.
I mean, they're huge. So, I mean, you know, there's probably a bunch of answers there, but go ahead.
Well, I mean, so the thing that I found most surprising, and I try to make it a point to give Tim props for this every chance that I get, is his connection of women in white to Bigfoot.
Yeah, that is that's the thing. Go ahead.
Well, he came to me and he said that, you know, like, have you ever noticed that women in white are associated with Bigfoot? I'm like, okay, what do you mean by that? I've never seen that. I don't think there's any legs to this. Like, because he cited an example. I'm like, okay, well, you know, if you can find new examples, come back to me. And I'll be damned. Like, it's one of those things that once you see it, you don't stop seeing it, you know? And I think it's, you know, that juxtaposition of the wild man archetype with the highly feminized virginal archetype, for lack of a better term. But you see it in, like, you know, you see it in King Kong, and you see it in Beauty and the Beast. And like, I even had somebody who told me that they thought that maybe the Christmas tree was a representation of the Bigfoot phenomena, because you've got the angel as the woman in white on the top, and you've got Santa Claus, who is, you know, folklorists will agree that Santa Claus is a variation on the wild man archetype, transmitted through the Woodwoes and Odin and other characters. And you've got the
medieval Santa Claus is something else.
Yeah,
go ahead.
But and then you've got the Christmas balls and the twinkling lights, like the orbs of light that are seen around Bigfoot as well, in areas of high Bigfoot activity. So like, once you start to see it, you can't unsee it. And Tim, I mean, it's the gift that keeps on giving. You talk about something that could probably be expanded out into a longer form book. I mean, that's one of them. That's definitely one of them. You know, that this woman in white thread that he started pulling on just keeps on, you know, is the gift that keeps on giving. One of the things that I always find the weirdest of these stories, and it makes sense to a certain degree, in my head, but it's still weird, are these like disembodied Bigfoot appendages, you know? Like people who
there's the hand or the arm that just
hand, or like the pair of Bigfoot legs that are running down the road, you know?
Oh yeah, that's really weird. Yeah.
I love those stories. I read one today for something else that I'm working on about, I mean, you know, it's one of those things that isn't Bigfoot and isn't Dogman, but people from both camps will try to cram it in there. There was a New Jersey, I think this was 1993. There was a New Jersey park ranger who was in Wharton State Forest, who happened upon a big, tall, hairy thing in the summer. He actually made an official report of it, that stepped out into the road as he was driving his truck, and it just stopped in the road, and he had to stop his car as well. And it looked at him with these glowing red eyes. It was about, I think, 6 feet tall and hairy, and he said that it had a head resembling a deer, and it didn't
Whoa.
seem to have any arms.
Damn.
And maybe 3 or 4 years ago, that would have thrown me for a loop. But now I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Wow.
Of course, it's no arms. So that's one of those things. The other thing that I tell you what, I was probably most surprised to see. Was everybody's aware of the 5-toed Bigfoot tracks. There are 4-toed Bigfoot tracks. Okay, whatever, that could be a wound or something. There are the 3-toed Bigfoot tracks, which are odd, but they're popularized enough that most people are aware of them. I wasn't entirely aware that there were Bigfoot tracks that looked like hooves. But sure enough,
Wow.
I believe this was like in the 1930s. I might have the date wrong, but it was called the Traverse Spine Gorilla, and it was in Labrador. Up in Canada, and it was this basically tall ape-like creature that would look in windows, but what it would leave behind would be these footprints that looked like ox footprints as opposed to Bigfoot footprints.
Wow.
And the interesting thing about that is, we were talking about how you can trace the Santa's origins through Odin and the Wild Man and the Wadwos, but the Wild Man itself you can clearly trace back through ideas of satyrs and fauns, which were hairy humans from the waist up and basically goats from the waist down.
Yes. Yes.
So it's almost like it's almost like a harkening back to that earlier version of the archetype in that story, like from the Traverse Spine Gorilla.
Yeah, I'm thinking of that. I mean, that's what Pan's supposed to look like, and that also the hoof prints remind me of the Jersey Devil, and wow, that's quite something.
Yeah, and then it's like a spider web. Tim's talked about this before, but like the Wildman archetype itself alone, because in case anybody's wondering who's listening, like I don't think Bigfoot's a flesh and blood creature anymore. I think it's somehow playing on this Wildman archetype. But the Wildman archetype alone is fascinating because the satyrs and the fauns were associated with pre-Christian pagan worship, and of course that got demonized. So the satyrs and the fauns, that sort of appearance got appended to the devil and to Satan. And a lot of people still call Bigfoot devils. Mountain devils is a very common term for Bigfoot. But also you can branch off, instead of branching off into the Christian demonization of satyrs and fauns into the devil, you can sort of take the other direction, which is Bigfoot as a Dionysus figure, as a Dionysian figure, which in turn has his own connections as the god of debauchery, has his own connections to the Green Man, which is also tied into the Wadwos as well. But it's quite explicitly in a lot of cases a shamanic figure, shamanic and perhaps even chthonic figure, a figure of the underworld, Dionysus in some traditions.
Wow.
So it's this gigantic spider web, and of course that the satyrs and the fauns are arguably a species of fairy as well, and plenty of comparisons to be made between Bigfoot and fairies. It keeps on branching off in these. It's like tributaries of a river that branch off in these other directions, and before you know it, you need to circle back around to talk about something you were talking about earlier. It makes it all quite difficult to talk about.
Yes, and people often think that fairies are always tiny, and that's not really the case, is it?
I mean, yeah, no. As a general rule, you could say that the things that really unite fairies are a love of kidnapping people, a tendency to live underground, and a tendency to be short. But even those are pretty fungible categories. A lot of the Western European fairies might be short, but a lot of them might very well appear human-sized. What it really seems to come down to, above all else, is that they were, inveterate size and shapeshifters. You'll find stories about. Here's another one. There's a story from County Tipperary about a fairy queen who transformed into all manner of things. She transformed into a dragon and a beautiful fairy queen because she was trying to get someone off of her land. And in this description that I found, it also said that she turned into an ape with chicken's feet. And I said, okay, wow. Ape with chicken's feet. Bigfoot that leaves behind three-toed tracks. Interesting.
The number of times that bird feet on something that's definitely not a bird come up in your research, it was pretty amazing to me.
Yeah, and it always looks like that. I mean, so in case anybody hasn't seen a three foot that'll be fun, a three-toed Bigfoot track, a three-toed Bigfoot track. All you gotta do is take a look at it and you can say, okay, well, I don't know what that is, but these answers that the cryptozoologist will give you, that it's a deformation or that it's from inbreeding, or they just don't know. It doesn't look like that. Like, it looks nothing like a primate foot. It does look a lot more like a bird foot, in my estimation. And, to the extent that in the South, a lot of people will say that these three-toed Bigfoot tracks are, alligator tracks, which is fine. But when you get into Pennsylvania or Oregon, that's almost as weird as Bigfoot, right? Having an alligator up there.
That's a thing that I find in a lot of the debunkers and the people who aren't explaining away, is sometimes your mundane explanation is harder to believe than the paranormal thing you're trying to say doesn't exist. Alligators in Pennsylvania, yeah.
Yeah, the never-ending circus train crash, right?
Yes. Which is never recorded anywhere.
Well, I've talked about this before, and Occam's razor gets weaponized a lot by skeptics, but what they don't really realize is that they're citing a monk who is using it to argue, theological arguments. So it's kind of a misplaced weapon in that sense anyway. But also, I mean, Occam's razor actually doesn't mean that the simplest answer is true. It means that you shouldn't multiply variables unnecessarily. And, I think the idea that there is an alligator that's living in Pennsylvania, like I said, is almost as hard to believe as the fact that there's just something out there that we don't know, full stop.
Yes, indeed.
So, yeah. But I'm trying to remember what I was talking about. Oh yeah, these three-toed tracks, you're right. And I think that there's something sinister to it. I think there's a loop.
I mean, it's weird. I mean, they're not. Why would they have bird feet? Except a lot of folkloric beings have bird feet.
And I think that you could make a cogent case that a lot of these Bigfoot, that leave behind the three-toed tracks tend to be more aggressive. You've got the Falk monster and the Missouri monster, Momo, spring immediately to mind. And Momo was famous for having, killing dogs. And, I think the first appearance had a dog under its arm. So, there's something to that. And I think just like the three-toed track, which again, sort of looks like that, I believe it's the Druden. No, I think it's either the Elhaz or the Druden foot. No, the Druden foot is the witch's foot, but the rune is called the Elhaz rune, I think. It just, something about it just feels real occulty to me, and not occulty in the way that we in the paranormal fields like to say, oh, it just means hidden. I mean occulty in that sort of negative occulty sort of way.
Yes, and I'm not. Let me put a couple of caveats on here. I don't mean the Judeo-Christian Orthodox theology, but it does seem kind of demonic, to be blunt.
Yeah. And that theme of three is something that shows up more often than people, I think, perceive as well. Nessie almost always has these three humps that float through the water, and Men in Black, the flying saucers and the three men. Like the first modern appearance of Men in Black was three men. And, how many times have you read a UFO report and it's like a trio of beings walked out of the craft? It's like, and people will tell you that demons show up at 3 a.m. and they leave 3 scratches, and
what I never get is people always say there's 3 knocks to mock the Trinity, and I'm like, really? That's your idea of mockery? Bang, bang, bang. Really? That's it? That's the worst the devil has to say? Come on.
well, the 3 a.m. thing kind of makes sense, because I think historically, canonically Christ died at 3 p.m. So it's like an
Oh,
inversion
yes.
of that.
The
I get that, but like
crucifixion,
3 knocks doesn't really seem to be
yeah.
it is kind of weak sauce,
Yeah, I've never
Um,
seen that really that's the best the devil would bring. Come on.
yeah,
You
I
know?
don't I don't buy it. But then you've got all those three-toed tracks all over Hellier. Some of the shenanigans that were going on there, and I think there was some mention of some of the nasty I think, okay, so somebody's going to listen to this and say that I got it wrong, but I think some Klansmen in Kentucky who were ex-Confederate soldiers would bury their treasure, and supposedly they used that same 3-pronged rune to mark a lot of their treasure areas,
Wow.
according to folk legend or whatever.
Yes.
And so that's something else that when I heard that on Pennyroyal this latest season. And when I heard that, I said, yeah, there's just something dark about that. And I haven't really dug enough into that specific rune to know if there's some sort of connotation there that's negative or not. But yeah.
If I can just digress for a second, people forget how occultic the Klan was.
Yeah.
They were, the reason they were dressed up in these outfits was to terrify people that they were ghosts. They pretended to be the ghosts of Confederate dead, and they would do things to fake paranormal phenomena, like drink incredible amounts of water with a rubber bladder to soak up the water, and do things to scare people. They wanted people to think they were ghosts, and the ghosts of the Confederate dead. And there was a whole occultic side to the Klan that was way beyond just being a hate group. And it's all very bad, but it's bad in a specific way,
Well, that's something that, again, like I'm invested in the paranormal, so I'm not trying to say that it's all bad, but I think we sort of fall into this trap when we're interested in these topics where we're so inundated with how negative this stuff is in popular culture that we sort of start to ignore the negativity that does come with it. But man, some of the stuff is dark and it will eat your lunch. And the fact that you've got that going on, and you've got the Nazi obsession with the occult, and I heard some interesting stuff about Putin being interested in a bunch of that stuff as well. And I guess, I mean, maybe it's just,
yes.
Well, and maybe it's just what you do when you become a bloodthirsty dictator or something. Like, you just got all this time on your hands. But it kind of makes me wonder if there isn't something that's drawing people to this. And I think it's something to guard against in your own practice as you look into these different topics. Like, that's why I'm glad I got the music to retreat to, because I've seen it, man. I've seen people who just like, I've seen people who just live this stuff and breathe this stuff, and it will, like I said, it'll eat your lunch. It really will.
This might sound dumb, but I'm not afraid to sound dumb. So anyway, one of the things that when I really need to get away from this, because you can't do this 24/7 and keep your head together. And they tell you that if you go into a formal, like studying, say, Kabbalah, you're supposed to be of a certain age, a certain stability in your life, because it can be erratic,
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big Green Bay Packers fan. And sometimes I just need to leave this all aside and go talk about the Green Bay Packers, because that is down to earth and regular mundane world. And that is kind of a pause, And
I mean, get a hobby, folks. Yeah.
And it's necessary, because if you eat and sleep this, it may have bad effects. And I mean, you can see countless examples. I'm thinking of Jack Parsons, but there's plenty of other people like that, that it ends up consuming you, and you don't want to get consumed. That's not good.
Yeah, no, yeah. And I think you can see that too with sort of the proliferation of some of the QAnon stuff and the way that it's drawn people in.
Oh yeah,
and all the sort of, frankly, occult occult trappings that are sort of around that. Like, I've seen people who, one minute they get involved in some of that stuff, and then the next they're sending me links to like Michael Sala's secret space warrior program and all this other BS, the real disreputable part of the UFO community who just make things up. And I'm like, how did you get from there to here? And it's because it's traveling in that same orbit,
Oh yes, and that's this is multi-dimensional. I don't mean it that way, but I mean there's people who are really interested in this stuff, and there's always grifters trying to find them and separate them from their money, and there's people using this for political gain. And I'm 51. When like a lot of conspiracy stuff started in the 90s, we were afraid of the feds. We're afraid the feds were going to come and kill us. Now it seems like a lot of people into that subgenre conspiracy theory want to be feds. They want to be deputized and go and get the bad guys. And that's a real change.
Well, it's the same thing that you saw in the UFO community around the time to the STARS Academy of Arts and Sciences, which I still maintain sounds like a Montessori school. When the TTSA stuff started coming out, how they were all cozying up to all these people who used to be part of these old 3-letter agencies, and I heard. I heard it said at one point, I think it was Chris O'Brien who said this, once a spook, always spooky. And, people don't retire lightly from from those agencies. You're kind of a lifer, I think, in a lot of cases. And here you have all these people from all those things partnering and suddenly being interested in, they're the ones who are going to tell you about the truth behind UFOs. Okay. Yeah. So it's sort of the same impulse, I think, in some ways, just wanting to join the like you said, join the feds, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'll just make this admission. Part of me knows that disclosure is probably BS. It's probably never going to happen. And why should we take people who spent 30 years doing disinformation? Now we're going to listen to the real truth. Really? I know how dumb that sounds, but a little part of me really wants them to bring out the crashed alien ship and announce it on the evening news. That that's just a thing that I'll probably never stop wanting, which will also probably never happen. And if it does, it's probably fake. But anyway, yes.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is that we're in this sort of post-truth world. Like, I mean, anybody in our authority structure can step out with an alien body tomorrow and be like, this is the real deal, they're here, and like half the country wouldn't believe it. I mean, I'd be in that half too, because I'm always skeptical of of what the government says about UFOs, but like for purely political reasons, people wouldn't believe it. So I think the idea that disclosure in that sense will ever be obtainable, I think is a bit optimistic, and I think that's kind of not keeping in line with my view of the phenomena, which I think is not extraterrestrial. I think that is part of the point behind the phenomena. Disclosure doesn't happen. Disclosure isn't given to you. Disclosure is something that you arrive at yourself. You sort of reach this critical mass, like I alluded to earlier. You have something happen to you where you Goldilocks your way there with data, and you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. You're like, okay, well, there's something to this. There's something going on, and as long as you can sort of maintain, in my opinion, the sort of level of healthy agnosticism about it, then there you go. That's your disclosure right there. You know that something's going on, and just resign yourself to the fact that in your lifetime, that's probably as good as it's going to be, you know?
I think you really hit the nail on the head there. Yes. So much of this also seems to me, and not only to me, but to many, to be performative. Like what you're seeing is a presentation that's made for you. And I've never seen a UFO. I saw a cryptid once. But what people see is geared to what they need to see.
Mm-hmm.
In some way.
I think your cryptid sighting really underscored that, right? Because your wife saw something completely different. She saw a Bigfoot and you saw a bear thing.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. Yes. Now it was a weird bear that can't exist in nature, but it was still two different things. Yes.
Right.
And we were there at the same moment, and thank God, because that way I wasn't having a psychotic break. But we both saw something. We saw something vaguely similar, but still very different. And it seems like we were meant to see what we saw, you know, and that was presented to us. And that, I don't know why that works that way, but I do believe it does work that way. That what you see is created for you to see.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Somebody could be standing next to you and not see the same thing.
Well, and that happens more than people realize, you know, that some people, you know, there's a story that I recorded where two people agree that they saw a UFO, but one saw a Thunderbird, the other one saw a giant amoeba flying through the sky, you know?
Wow. Okay.
There, you know, but there are also stories of people who disagree on how many lights there were or the color of the lights. There are stories even back into the ghost tradition where, you know, there was a story that I found in, one of the caretakers of the Tower of London was eating dinner with his wife, and he and I think someone else saw it, but his wife and another person who was there at the dinner party didn't see this like cylindrical arm that was flying through the through the dining room.
Wow.
And yeah, and it's like so obviously, you know, I think these things are tailor made, you know, for a very specific audience at the time. And you know, people will be like, well, I didn't, you know, nothing profound happened to me because of that. Why would it care? But I think maybe you might not realize what the purpose was, you know, or maybe the purpose behind it was to keep you from doing something or to do something that might seem completely unrelated, but it nonetheless pushed you in that direction. Like, I think that's, if you had to ask me exactly what I think it is, I think it might have something to do with that. You know, it's this extremely highly personalized experience that sometimes you get to, you know, share with other people. But I believe that it's a theatrical presentation meant for the person who experiences it. I really do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Not to shift gears too hard, but going back to your Bigfoot research, could you tell us a little bit about I don't think I've ever heard it except from you and Timothy Renner, but there's an equivalent to the Men in Black for Bigfoot. Two guys that go around and they're like the same two guys and they like try to silence witnesses or something.
Yeah. This is something that emerged more recently on, you know, the Sasquatch Chronicles podcast. I think he popularized it, where there are these individuals, and, you know, depending on your perspective, you think that it's government agents or something stranger. I, of course, tend to fall into the idea that it's something stranger, but it's a real odd couple. One is dressed like a, you know, stereotypical G-man in his suit, and he's slider build, and he's, you know, very clean cut. And the other one is, by all accounts, a very tall kind of biker dude, oftentimes wearing a checkered flannel shirt with a white t-shirt underneath, big beard. And typically it's both or just the biker dude.
Huh.
And they will show up and they will harass witnesses and tell them that they saw what they didn't think they saw. You saw a bear, you saw the rear end of a deer, you saw this or that or the other. There's a story from Glacier National Park where a young ranger, a young guy working in the Forestry Service, stumbled upon a Bigfoot with his friend, and this guy rocks it the next day. Now, his friend's uncle that he saw it with claimed that he knew the man and that he was from Dillon, Montana, and all this stuff. But he made a big show of questioning the witness's credibility in front of him. And okay, so that might be, I think he showed up in a big black SUV with government plates, and that might be a government agent. Sure, why not? But there are other stories that are a lot more peculiar where they show up before the witness has mentioned it to anyone. There's a story that Tim collected where this guy, this big biker guy, and the more slender gentleman were harassing a police officer who, on his beat, kept on running into these reports of gorillas. And he was sort of, passively looking into it, had a little bit of interest in it. And the two individuals harassed him and told him to stop. He confronted the bigger individual, and he got suspended. And when he was reinstated, he was called out on a prowler call. And he was alongside the house, and long story short, he didn't find a prowler. He found a Bigfoot that was, threw a log rather at his head and barely missed him. And he pulls his firearm on it and aims at the Bigfoot, and he's distracted by a sound from behind him. And he glances, and when he glances back, the Bigfoot isn't there, but the biker dude is. And wow. And the biker dude comes up and puts his hand on his shoulder and says, "Couldn't pull the trigger, could you? Good man." And, if you want to tell me that's a government agent, I guess he could have been, shadowing him or something. But I can't.
That's some pretty deep cover,
Yeah, exactly. And, what was pointed out by our mutual friend Barbara Fisher's daughter, Morgana, was that they kind of sound like bear and coyote, or bear and wolf showing up to defend the forest, right? And in one of these accounts, where the in Glacier National Park, the guy actually told his the guy who said that his name was Gary, he said, "No, you call me Bear. You call me Bear." So that's the sort of level that I like to operate on, is this idea that maybe there's just this whatever the phenomena is, there's this built-in defense mechanism. And, I'm not so sure that, you see that with the Men in Black, right? Anybody who wants to tell you that even most of the strange Men in Black are government agents, I don't even know what to tell you, because they just don't act like it. They're almost always like these corpses wearing makeup,
Yes.
They seem to be much more part and parcel of the UFO phenomena itself. And I think something similar is going on with the Bigfoot phenomena, but appropriately enough, it sort of bends itself to a figure of authority that might resonate more with an outdoorsy type, which is, a big, biker dude who beat you,
and don't they claim to be from the Bureau of Land Management or something?
Yeah, I've heard the Bureau of Land Management. I've heard Homeland Security. They say different places and say different things, but like I said, and this sort of line of thinking, for me at least, extends to maybe these people and the Bigfoot are one and the same, because
somehow connected. Yeah.
Well, a lot of the indigenous traditions, and I'm not deliberately speaking monolithically about them, but there are so many that A, don't have them on the tip of my tongue, and B, would take a while to enumerate. But a lot of indigenous traditions specifically talk about Bigfoot and their Bigfoot, analogs as being shapeshifters. Mm-hmm. And you find hints of this here and there, they talk about, Bigfoot prints, not only, the trackways not only abruptly ending, but sometimes the trackways shape shifting into another form, like a shoe, or tracks from shoes, or there's a story that I collected. There's a story that I can't remember the guy's name, but he collects Bigfoot stories, and it was these four-wheeler riders in, I believe it was Pennsylvania, and they spotted a Bigfoot that crossed in front of them, and they said, hey, it's coming into these trees. Where it should come out will be on the other side. So they circled around to where they thought they would catch it coming out the other side of this grove of trees, and there wasn't a Bigfoot, but there was like a 1950s greaser who was like Fonzie, right?
Yeah, yes.
Like and he was smoking a cigarette that like didn't smell, but still like left some smoke, and he was wearing these like pristine white boat shoes, even though it was muddy, and they were talking to him, and he said, I haven't seen anything strange. And then for some reason they were both distracted, and they looked away, and when they looked back, he was gone.
Yes, indeed.
That might not have been, I can't say that definitely is tied to the Bigfoot thing, but like it's like when people want to dismiss UFOs seen in the vicinity of Bigfoot, like, okay, well, it's rare to see Bigfoot, it's even rarer to see a UFO. As Tim says, like, how much rarer is it to see them both together, or they're connected. So in that case, I think that it's I guess whatever phenomena is behind Bigfoot, he's just like a greaser, just a Fonzie. There we go. We'll do that.
And that, again, that's a perfect example of one of those things that you can't prove ever that wasn't just some guy in jeans and a leather jacket, but it makes no sense for that to happen. That it defies logic.
Right.
You've pointed out something that I've noticed with the Men in Black and especially the Men in Black. They purport to be silencers. They're going to shut these people down, but yet they don't seem to really silence people all that effectively. Unless there's a bunch of people that are silenced that we don't know about. It seems like people talk about this stuff anyway, and nothing ever comes of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I don't know if it's
we
say that because we never hear from the people that were truly intimidated, right?
And maybe they were silenced. Maybe that does happen, but it just seems like also
it's heavy-handed.
Yes,
right. I mean, it's very heavy-handed. And I don't know. I mean, that's sort of when you almost get into ideas. Ideas in the magical tradition of these things feeding off of fear or something along those lines, which I think is, possible. Yeah.
That's a different way of looking at it I had not thought of. What I was thinking of is it's almost like performative again, that they want you to think you're on the right track. This is a big deal. You better not talk to anybody because, you're going to be in big trouble. The big trouble never comes, but it spreads the story, and it makes people think that, that must be what happened.
Well, it's that old, I think it's the Herbert Schirmer abduction from Nebraska, where he was taken, and they said, what do you want? They said, we want you to believe in us, but not too much.
Yeah, that is a perfect phrase. Yes, that has always stuck in my mind. Oh man, let me see. We have gone around a little bit. Just, do you mind a few random off the wall questions?
I love random. Are you kidding me? I love random off the wall questions.
Okay, I will feel free to hit you with stuff that doesn't necessarily relate to anything we've talked about previously. What's your take on Atlantis? And I don't expect you to have any prepared answer. I'm just talking here.
No, I mean,
just two guys talking.
I think it's highly possible, maybe even probable, that there was a civilization that was out to sea, and we have this idea that anything, including evolution, but also human progress, is this straight line, straight vertical, straight incline.
Oh yes.
And I don't think that's the case at all. I think that civilizations have risen and peaked, like using using media that we haven't even thought to use. You look at some of those Egyptian sculptures that are made of diorite that are just like, could barely, if at all, be machined today. And it's like, well, obviously they had some sort of technology that we haven't even thought about implementing. So yeah, I think that it's entirely possible that there was a civilization like that. I mean, it's kind of like the flood myth. Like you hear too many analogs for it to be nonsense. Now, do I think that they spread across the world and that they built the Native American mounds and that they we've all been reincarnated because they were star seeds from Zeta Reticuli or something? No. But I do think it's entirely possible that there's something like that, and I think it's also possible that like we've already found it, we just don't recognize it, in that sort of Graham Hancock territory, things like the Bimini Road and some of these other anomalies in the seafloor. I think it's entirely possible.
You mentioned earlier something with the Fae and living underground. What do you think of theories and stories of a hollow earth or a huge cavern that contains, civilization?
I mean, there's something to it, and you find this time and time again, but the way that I tend to look at that nowadays, and I should hope that if you asked me in another 2 years, I would think differently. But the way that I often think about it is more as a metaphorical motif, talking about how these things dwell in our subconscious and come out from the subconscious. Similar thing with lake monsters, in the way that they peak up above the water and then they essentially go underground, right? They go underneath the waves. So that's kind of what I think, but I'm not writing off the possibility that there's something genuinely strange underneath the earth. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, some of these cave systems are just staggeringly huge, and those are just the ones that we have access to and that we've discovered. And you hear the stories of Bigfoot popping in and out of these caves and abandoned mines so often. But again, I think that it probably speaks to that on a more metaphorical level than a literal level, because that's just the way that I tend to think about these things, is that they can be physical, but we have some sort of co-creative role to play in the way that they manifest. And I think that might be what it's trying to tell us.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I get the impression that they're physical for a time. They're physical while they're right in front of you, but they're not physical all the time. That they don't have a nest somewhere that you can discover it and here they are. Here's their den.
We're gonna go find the Mothman egg. Yeah, like Tim always says. Yeah.
Yes, you're not going to find that. There's not a lot of these things. As being a flesh and blood creature, it's just not. It's not possible without. America has and Canada has vast forests and swamps. That something like that could exist, but then nobody'd ever see it.
Right.
If we're seeing it frequently, and it was just a physical being, the same as a raccoon, let's say, we'd have a dead one, or we'd have a live one. We'd have a body.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing that the flesh and blood Bigfooters always say is well, we don't find a lot of cougar carcasses and a lot of bear carcasses. And I'm like, yeah, but in the course of human history, people have found these things, And
you can go to the zoo and see the cougar and see the bear, and you can find them stuffed at the taxidermy place, and we have that. This is something where we don't have that, and again. There's like the orang pendek, that supposedly upright walking orangutan that lives in the rainforest, and I think it's Borneo. Okay, something like that could exist, but nobody ever sees it because it's in the absolute middle of nowhere. You can't be seeing these things, an hour's drive from Chicago,
right.
and never have a body,
Yeah, and I mean, actually, there are a couple of cases that we found, like cases in Chicago,
Oh yes.
in some of these parks and stuff. And it's like, it's not a thing. Having said that, all cryptids are not created equal. Like, I think that of the hominids that are out there, I think orang pendek is a great candidate for something that could actually be a flesh and blood creature. But I think that, like, the analogy that I like to use is the way that Mike Clellan talks about the owls, right? Mike, of course, believes that there are real owls out there, right? But sometimes they show up in the wake of or precede these UFO sightings, and it seems like they're much stranger and much different. Now, is that, the phenomena using the mask of an owl to appear a certain way, or is it like them warging, to use a Game of Thrones term, into an owl, and taking over its faculties? I don't know, but we can have multiple things going on at the same time, and it may very well be that in the Pacific Northwest there is a very, quote unquote mundane flesh and blood, large hairy hominid that's out there. But to say that that's always the case, I just can't get behind that explanation when you see some of the strange stuff that's happening.
Yes, and you've really, dug up a lot of the connections. The way that you and Tim Renner took apart the Ape Canyon story was pretty great. I mean, that story gets told and told and told and told, but with all the weird stuff left out.
Yeah, that might be one of the other things that really blew my mind when I found it. And again, I'll be damned. There's a woman in white in there. There's a specter of a woman that they called Vander White, whom they named their mine after, who supposedly led them to their mining claim. But the only thing that you hear about in the cryptozoological literature is, their cabin was attacked by a bunch of Bigfoot. They don't talk about that. They don't talk about there being a large white arrow in the sky that they followed. Yes. They don't talk about, Fred Beck having apports happen at the cabin. He had a pencil flash into his grip. One thing that I found that I think, I'm going to toot my horn here a little bit, I don't think anybody had put this together, because even in people who acknowledged the stranger aspects of the Ape King story, I'd never seen this before. But there was a newspaper article that I found that was an allusion to an attack on miners in a cabin near Mount St. Helens that same year. So it's got to be Ape Canyon. But there are some allusions to them going up and finding footprints around the cabin, but they were all of one of the feet, I believe, they were all left foot. And it's like, okay, well, that's and of course the article was like, this is why it was a hoax. But I'm like, okay, no, that makes perfect sense. So that's another layer of oddity that you can layer onto the Ape Canyon stuff.
And if somebody was going to hoax it, they'd make a left and a right foot. The hoax would be a lot more convincing than that.
Right. Pardon the pun. Right.
Exactly. Sometimes the explaining away is less logical than, we just don't know why that would happen.
Yeah.
But it happened, to totally change, well, maybe not totally, but to change topics, with climate change happening, what do you think, if anything, we're going to find with Antarctica?
So, I mean, I want the stories of pyramids in Antarctica and stuff like that to be true. And I think that there's something to that, or that there could be something to it, because, I mean, you talk about places that we just don't have a lot of good intel on, right? That would be one of them. But I think it was Soraya who said that in conversation with Walter Bosley, that he or someone he knew had been told about pyramids in Antarctica, and he was told not to tell anybody about them, and he didn't. And then you have these whistleblowers coming out and saying, they told me that there were pyramids in Antarctica, and he suggested, and I think this sort of thing goes on a lot more than we realize, he said that he thought that maybe it was a test to discern who could be trusted with sensitive information and who couldn't be.
A confidentiality test. We're going to tell you something amazing, and if you can keep it to yourself, then you've earned our trust. If you're on a podcast talking about it, then we're probably not going to tell you much else.
Right. And, you find these things here and there. I remember, I don't want to misspeak because I don't think it's my place, and I can't remember the exact name of the documents either, but there was a friend of mine who was actually asked to publish some transcripts pertaining to something along the lines of a secret space program. And when they published them online, they were contacted by their source and said, "Why did you do that?" And they said, "What are you talking about?" And they said, why did you change things? It was like, well, all I did was fix some typos and some punctuation. And they said, "No, you are to print it exactly as it was written." Which to me and to this friend of mine sounds a lot like a cipher, right? It sounds like there's a cipher or something encoded in that message for whatever that the audience truly was.
You bring up a valuable point that yes.
So I think
all of this stuff, there's always like some cryptic spycraft going on.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a good place for it to hide. It's like it's like restaurants in the mafia. It's just a good place for this sort of thing to hide. Yeah.
And I mean, I'm thinking of way back to John Dee being the Queen's mystic, but also being like the head of her intelligence service. And how much is magic grimoires and how much is coded language for much more like military purposes.
And again, it's probably a little bit of both. Because I do believe that old adage, I think it was John Jacob Astor who said that millionaires don't believe in astrology, billionaires do. And I think that there's something like the people who have their act together, at least in terms of the way that we think of having their act together by being rich. That's the way we think of it nowadays.
Yes.
Or powerful, or powerful. They place a lot of weight in this, and whether or not that's some sort of obsessive compulsive superstition or it's that there's something to it, I don't know. Again, probably somewhere in between, I would imagine. But yeah, I think that there's something like that. And there's so much of this stuff. I mean, the same thing with the whole TTSA thing. The Navy's like, "Oh, we're taking civilian UFO reports for the first time in forever." And I'm like, does that not sound like crowdsourcing to you?
Yes, indeed.
So you've always got to be on the lookout for that sort of thing, I think.
Mm-hmm. And exactly. So there's so many things that go on behind the scenes that it's awfully tough to get I'll just say it's impossible to get an accurate picture of how the world really works, and every once in a while you'll have someone come forward and say, "Hey, this totally crazy thing was revealed to me," and you're never going to find whether that was true or not.
Yeah.
Hey, I guess we should we're kind of reaching the 2-hour mark here. We should probably kind of wrap things up here, Josh. Thanks a ton for coming by. Always fascinating to talk with you. Please, is there anything you'd like to tell our audience about your band, about your books, about anything?
Well, this has been an absolute blast, and I'd like to reiterate that. I think we talked about this beforehand, but there are some people that you can just sit down with and just chat with because they can hang and they can and they can talk about this stuff. And there some people that it's like it's like pulling teeth, and this was not the latter. So, but
It's been really cool. I will always love talking with you, man.
I have a bunch of irons in the fire right now. You can find out stuff about me, books and whatnot at JoshuaCutchin.com, JoshuaCutchin.com. Links to all my interviews are up there, as well as where you can find my books. I, surprisingly enough, do have some events coming up this summer, which is extremely refreshing after everything with COVID.
God, yes.
Yeah. The first of which is that I will be, very proud of this. I will be at DragonCon in Atlanta. I've been submitting like, hey, can I be a guest? Can I be a guest? And finally they said I can be. Now I have no idea what that's going to entail, but but it is just right down the road.
Not from Georgia. What is DragonCon? Go ahead.
It is primarily a comic book convention, but they do have a supernatural track. So DragonCon this year will be September 1st through 5th in Atlanta. And DragonCon.org, I think it is.
I mean, really, the name alone, you pretty much got me. But go ahead.
Oh, and they have some like top tier celebrity guests. I think it's like maybe it's like sub San Diego Comic-Con for in terms of the sort of guests that they bring in and stuff. Then August 5th through 7th, I will be in Cape Girardeau, Missouri at the Strange Tales Midwest Conference on the Unknown. You can find that at Cape Events, cape-events.com. They're still getting the website up and running, but that'll be happening as well with a real rogues gallery of speakers. And then the following weekend, I told you I was busy, I will be at the Worldwide Metaphysical Tribe meetup, August 11th through 14th in Franklin Grove, Illinois. So just down the road from you, actually. And I'll be giving, it's a sort of a weekend retreat that they do, and I'll be speaking at that as well. So yeah, a lot of things coming down the pike this summer. I have 2 books that are, one is completely finished. Well, 3 books, I guess. One is completely finished. The other 2 are making their way there. The first one is an essay on that I edited and contributed to an essay collection of looking at different films through the fairy folklore lens and seeing how they sort of express those motifs in ways that you expect and don't expect. So like, we've got movies that are talking about fairy stuff, and we also have like Dune in there as well. So okay. Yeah, and Rocky Horror and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Like it's a real cross section, and then Dark Crystal and Labyrinth. Okay, so it really runs the gamut. And then I have 2 books, a 2-parter that's coming out hopefully in a couple of months. Called Ecology of Souls, A New Mythology of Death and the Paranormal. And that is, I didn't intend for it to be Josh's theory of everything right now, but like the more I started peeling it away, the more like, oh, this is kind of where my head is at in general. And that is going to talk about, obviously, significant portion of it is the UFO experience, but also everything from monuments to ley lines to near-death experiences to ancient pagan deities to, of course, fairies and cryptids as well. So it's like it became Josh's theory of everything. So that'll be coming down the pipe soon. I'm really excited about it. So, but I don't want to put any time tables on it because you know how that goes. As soon as you say that,
the publishing world takes place in another land that we don't know.
Yeah. But we
does not exist.
But we are. I would feel comfortable saying that we are quite close now, and I've incorporated all my edits, and I'm just waiting on the layout to be all set and for some endorsements to come in. So
cool. Sounds really great. Well, hey, thank you for being a guest. Had a great time talking with you, and hopefully have you back here pretty soon.
Thanks so much, Vincent. This is a blast.
All right. Folks, this has been The Weird Part. I am your host, Vincent Treewell. Thanks for listening, and good night.